If you missed my last video on Shining Force CD, I'll have a link to it in the description, but here's what you need to know. Shining Force CD has a neat history. Book 1, also called Shining Force Gaiden, is really fun with unique battle designs, but is a little linear. Finding hidden characters involves searching every tile on the battlefield, and there are no towns that you can explore and talk to NPCs in. Now with all that out of the way, let's finish up taking a closer look at Shining Force CD. Book 2 of Shining Force CD follows the same story as the Game Gear title, Shining Force 2 Sword of Haja, which takes place directly after the events of Book 1, titled Shining Force Gaiden. What's really cool about the CD version of the story though is that if you have the data from Book 1 on the same memory card, then your character data will transfer over to the new game. However, this time around we follow a new protagonist, Mac, or as he's canonically known, Diana, sorry, I'm just gonna call him Mac. Mac is mysteriously found by some cliffs just as the good Prince Bofner is leading his forces to Iom, or as it's canonically pronounced, Eom. And if you were attentive to the battle sprites during Book 1, you'll notice that, oh hey, it's Claude and Randolph going into battle with the prince. While the prince is away, the Sword of Haja is stolen from the castle, and it's up to the palace guards and Mac to chase down the thieves and get it back. The story in Book 2 is good, but I think the twists and turns in Book 1 were a little better executed. A lot of the events in the story feel contrived and added just for fluff, however, Book 2 makes up for this in other aspects. The big issue I have with the story overall is really Mayfair. Like, girl, how do you not remember Claude? He was one of the 2 birdmen that fought alongside you to save your kingdom. Like, I guess we can give her a pass since she was blind in Book 1, but you were literally there when he left for battle at the beginning. Also, wait, how is she all of a sudden cured of her blindness? They never mention it in-game. This is something I would think they might address in a more or less story-driven game, but oh well. Now, one of the issues I addressed in Book 1 in my first video was that there wasn't enough character development. It was always just Lo and Bofner talking about what they would do next, or speaking to someone about to join the Force through a single line of dialogue. Aside from that, no other members are developed further. This makes seeing familiar characters again feel like we get to know them a little bit more this time in Book 2. Now, it's not like each character has a developed arc or anything, but it makes the cast from the first game feel like they have more significance. When you first meet up with a character that you've met before, it feels like they're more of a living being in this world rather than just a piece in my game of tactical JRPG chess. In Book 1 we had a lot of creative battles with interesting terrain to traverse, and I specifically cited a battle where your party was split in half on a boat as being really fun and really creative. Well, Book 2 kicks it up a notch. Instead of just splitting the party for a battle, the party gets split for an entire chapter. This was easily my favorite part of Book 2. We get these 2 perspectives going on simultaneously with small Shining Force groups. I absolutely loved controlling each small but high-level force. In particular, I really loved the battles where Natasha is the Force leader. The change of having a tanky melee leader to a fragile spellcaster made such a big difference. I had to be super careful not to put Natasha in compromising situations. If Max stepped onto the front lines, he could take a couple hits without me worrying, but Natasha gets down in just about 2 hits by most enemies at this point. Not to mention, there's also 1 less healer because the other half of the Shining Force has him with them. However, most of my complaints from the first campaign still hold true here. First of all, there's no new music in this chapter, so everything is pretty much the exact same that you've heard for 20 hours before. Finding secret characters in this game is obtuse. There are no hints on their location, so I was actually unable to find either of them this time around. And there's still no towns to explore, even though this time there's literally a town that you explore in a cutscene. Like, come on, I want to walk around and look for people. Just let me do it! But overall, I had a bit more fun with Book 2 than Book 1. However, I think Book 3 is where Shining Force CD really shines. Now, I can't get into Book 3 without explaining its significance. Book 3, as you may have guessed, is the final part of the Shining Force Gaiden series. However, it never saw a release outside of the Sega or Mega CD, not even in Japan. Game Gear owners never got the Shining Force Gaiden trilogy and were instead left on a sort of cliffhanger ending to the Sword of Haja. Book 3 is not only locked away by owning a frickin' Sega CD, but you also have to complete both Book 1 and Book 2 before unlocking it. Now, I don't think this is unreasonable by any means, except that this is where the RAM cart comes into play. The internal memory on the Sega CD is not large enough in order to store the data for all 3 books of Shining Force CD, let alone any other games you may be playing on it, so you're essentially forced to not only own the Sega CD and a copy of the game, but also the RAM cartridge. Still though, this is comparable to owning a PlayStation or GameCube, both of which were systems that needed memory cards. The real pain in the butt, especially nowadays, is that even though your save data is stored on the RAM cart, for whatever reason, the data that says that you have completed either Book 1 or Book 2 is stored in the internal memory of the Sega CD. Now back in the day this wouldn't have been an issue with a brand new Sega CD, but now things are old. Their internal batteries are either dead or dying. Thankfully, they are rechargeable as long as they are plugged in, but that means if you unplug your Sega CD, like I did, you will lose track of the data saying that you beat Book 1. So, after I beat Book 2, I was confused as to why I couldn't find an option to start Book 3. It was only after I had done some digging online that I found out since I had unplugged my Sega CD and had to reformat it, I had lost the data that said that I had completed the first book. So, after beating Book 2, I had to go back and beat Book 1 again for the second time, which ended up taking about an additional hour and a half. I'm not talking about beating the whole book again, just the final battle. But after I finished that, I was able to start Book 3. Book 3 is a much shorter story that spans across only about 6 battles. After peace has once again been restored to Cyprus and Guardiana, Prince Bofner is greeted by 4 strangers during his crowning ceremony who, once again, capture Queen Henri and tell him that he must prove his worth in order to become king. The first thing that stuck out to me was how amazing the new character portraits are. Each character is so different from anything that we've seen up to this point, and that's pretty much how the rest of Book 3 goes. Everything feels new and fresh. Unlike Book 2, there's tons of new music, new enemy designs, items are scattered everywhere, and the story doesn't take itself seriously at all. I was shocked at how silly it was. The first 2 stories were alright, normal Shining Force fare, but I felt like they were trying a little too hard to be serious sometimes. This time around there were more jokes, and I was actually laughing out loud as Bofner and Guyan started macking on the 3rd stage boss. And I absolutely loved the new music in Book 3. There's this motif going on through the entire soundtrack of all 3 books, and it's easily heard through most of the new songs. It gives a tangible connection between the 3 stories. Just listen to a few examples. And the music fits so well with the battle layouts. My favorite battle had to be the Eastern Garden fight. Not only was it a really cool theme to see in a fantasy game, but the layout of the battle made it incredibly challenging, yet still consistent with what was going on in the cutscene previous. Bofner and Guyan were flirting with the women over at the entrance of the building, so naturally when the battle starts, Bofner is all alone at the entrance while everyone else is standing in the field. I ended up beating the entire book in one sitting. Since it was so short, this wasn't too much of a challenge, but it definitely stood out most amongst the 3 books in the Shining Force CD game. I was surprised at how many new assets were used in it too, especially considering how short it is compared to the rest of the game. There's new music, new enemies, new bosses, new environments. It felt like I was popping in a new game rather than playing the last bit of Shining Force CD. And most importantly, pretty much all of the complaints that I had about the previous 2 books sort of disappear with this one. I mean, since the story is so short and well written, I don't mind that there aren't any towns, especially since it wouldn't really make sense to go in them because the entire game takes place in one big mansion. There's like 10 new tracks of music this time around, so the 15 or so tracks that spanned across the first 2 books get to take a break from being constantly played. And since Book 3 is like a culmination of the first 2 stories, all of our old friends from both books are back, making them feel more than just one-time use characters. Unfortunately, if you didn't find the hidden characters in previous books, you can't play them here, but I think that's fair. And this time, instead of hidden characters placed on random tiles in one of 30 or so battles, every single battle has a ton of hidden items scattered everywhere, so searching all the tiles on a battlefield is much more fun since the reward is more frequent. It feels more like a bonus than something integral to helping me get through the game, since Book 3 starts you off with good equipment from the start. So this leads us to Book 4. Unfortunately, I cannot comment on Book 4, as I wasn't able to unlock it. Here's a tip: when you're playing through one of the earlier battles in Book 2, do not miss the museum ticket randomly hidden in this well. If you do not pick it up during this battle, you have no way of unlocking Book 4. And since I don't like to use strategy guides on my first playthroughs of games, I totally missed it. From what I've read online, Book 4 is similar to the secret battle after the credits of Shining Force 2. I guess it's just a really difficult battle where all the enemies are bosses, so I'm not too upset that I missed it, but I think it would have been better to hide this item in Book 3 since there are already so many hidden items, and playing again through Book 3 wouldn't be nearly as much of an ordeal as playing through Book 2 again. Now the big question is Shining Force CD worth playing? Well, that's a tough question to answer, honestly. As I said before, not only do you need a Sega Genesis, you also need a working Sega CD, the backup RAM card, and a copy of the game itself. If you don't have these already, you're looking at around a $300 to $400 investment just to play it, maybe more in the future. Granted, it is technically 2, maybe 3-ish games on there, but I think there's better alternatives. If you want to be totally legal about it and not spend a fortune, I would probably have to recommend playing Sword of Haja on the 3DS eShop while you still can, and either watching a playthrough the rest of the experience or just sit tight and hope we get a re-release of some sort one day. Otherwise, the only way to play would be through emulation. As much fun as I did have playing through Shining Force CD, it still isn't as good as Shining Force 2. I personally think it's worth it to own the real thing, but I already own a Sega CD, and I'm a collector. I also really love playing games that require stupid stuff like a RAM cart and a CD add-on. That's half the fun for me. But in the end, it's up to you. All I can tell you is that if this is the one Shining Force game that you haven't been able to play, then I'd go for it. The price is only going to go up. I'm Bofner, and I'll see you all next time!